Half of our afternoon, and you all went quiet magically just at the same time, so thank you very much indeed for that. I'm Richard Howitt. I've got many good friends in the audience, but I'm a strategic advisor on corporate responsibility and sustainability, business and human rights. For the last 3 years, I've been heading up the International Integrated Reporting Council, working with the major sustainability frameworks on how they can align. But before that, I was European Rapporteur on Corporate Responsibility for many years and took a... Is the microphone working? Yeah. It is. Before that, I was European Rapporteur on Corporate Responsibility for many years and took a key role in getting the EU directive agreed back in 2014. And I always say that I plead guilty for all the bad things in it and take no credit for the good things. And in this session this afternoon, we've all absorbed the information from the survey, but we're going to now reflect on what the implications of that are in terms of the reform of the directive coming up. And we're going to be doing it with a very expert panel representing the investment, the business and the stakeholder community. So we hope to keep you entertained and informed over the next hour. As someone who was involved in 2014, it was described at that time as the leading legislation on corporate transparency in the world. But I think whether there were some of us involved then or those involved in Parliament, Commission and the wider policy community now, the world has changed, and it is absolutely right that a fresh look comes to the directive, and we're going to be trying to discuss which that best look might be over the course of the next hour. I would like to join with all the others who've congratulated the Alliance for Corporate Transparency and Frank Bold colleagues. They have done the most phenomenal job, and if you haven't met them yet, Philip Gregor, who you saw before the break, but also their team, Susanna Arus, Joanne Houston and Christina Villoporva, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, were available during the break and will be available during the cocktail at the end, and they would all be very, very pleased indeed to be able to see you. Now, Charlotte Gard, who some of you know, was also going to be joining this panel, but for personal reasons she has been unable to join us at very late notice, so she sends her sincere apologies. Charlotte heads up the French government's work on sustainable finance, both in France and at the European level. And many of you will know that she was the rapporteur for the work done with Patrick de Cambourg that was submitted to the French Minister of Finance in order to see how the quality, comparability and standard of ESG, environment, social governance information could be improved. That was done in June last year. And I think it's fair to say that that report has had an important influence here in Brussels, which has been, I think, one of the key influences that led to the Vice President of the European Commission, Dombrovskis' announcement of moving towards European standard setting on ESG, which will be one of the areas that we'll be discussing this afternoon. Charlotte has sent a short message, which I'm going to read to you now. As stated in the report that Patrick de Cambourg and I delivered to the French Minister of Economy and Finance, I indeed believe that Europe can be the land of choice for extra financial information. Developing a reform of its regulatory framework as well as a standardisation process corresponds to a strong sensitivity expressed by EU citizens and to the momentum already observed, driven largely by companies themselves. Public legitimacy needs to be given to non-financial reporting standards, and they need to be clear, because today existing overlapping international reporting standards and setups confuse companies and investors. And because an ESG reporting framework does reflect the sustainable development objectives companies have to achieve in order to achieve carbon neutrality and the SDGs. Now, there will be some in the audience who agree wholly with that, others that might disagree with some elements, and I'm sure that will be part of the discussion we'll be having this afternoon. Who are on the panel with me? On my right, Rosl Veltmeijer, who is Portfolio Manager at Triodos Investment Management. We all know about the growth of socially responsible investors, sometimes ESG investors, sometimes called impact investors, but this is a a very, very growing movement and change within the investment community. But Triodos Investment Management was there 15 years ago as one of the early leaders in this field, and you've been present as their head of research, advising other institutional investors as well as within the company itself, and you now head up their work as its portfolio manager. So thank you so much for joining us. On my left, Lene, Serpa, who is Head of Sustainability Engagement and Reporting at AP Moller Maersk, the biggest shipping company in the world, but also working in a sector which is the 6th biggest emitter of carbon in the world. So you've got big challenges on your books. The group was recently awarded the best sustainability report of any listed company in Denmark. They have been the first shipping company in the world to set a net zero carbon target, and they've been testing ships or working on biofuels in the midst of our seas. So you've got a lot of expertise to share with us, and many of us are grappling with the challenge of how do you turn round a super tanker quickly, and you're someone who's actually doing it. So thank you very much for being here.
But the company. Yeah.
With them. And lastly, we've got Sebastien Godinot, who is the economist at the WWF European Policy Office and head of their Sustainable Finance Unit. He leads the WWF programme, focusing on the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, and he was Serpa for the WWF representative on the high-level expert group on sustainable finance. He is a huge champion of corporate transparency. He doesn't go far enough as far as he's concerned. He represents the stakeholder voice on this panel, and they are full and active members of the Alliance for Corporate Transparency. He's called for an end to all EU investment in fossil fuels. And when the Sustainable Activities Taxonomy was about to be proposed, he said, I don't want this to be for the 5% that's called sustainable, I want it to be for the 95% that isn't. So I think he will provide an interesting part of this panel's discussions. So let's start with a very, very simple question. I'll start with you, Rosl. You've heard the presentation, and we've all had the privilege of being able to have a read of the background information before today. What's your first response that you would like to share, having heard all of those survey findings?
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, I realized it was a lot of information to digest, also for us, even though we had a sneak preview of the data. So the good news is there is some progress. The bad news is that I think the progress is going far too slow. And that's also something I can relate to as a portfolio manager. So I work on the listed equity and the listed bond side. And what we see, and I'm in a luxurious, how do you say that, a position. We are a concentrated investor. We have a buy and hold strategy, so we can really build a relationship with the companies. We can really get to know them. We can really get our hands into what the company's doing. And even for us, it's an enormous amount of work to grasp what companies are doing. And that already starts with what is the mission, what is the purpose of the company. And we saw the results that half of the companies don't even have a purpose or a mission, or they don't share it with us. So I can relate to the conclusions. We have the same experience. I also have to say that when we do reach out to companies, and we often have to, then my experience, companies do have a lot more information than what they typically display. So it's just on the other side, maybe not as bad as these results show, but it's simply when we ask the company why do they not report this data, they say, well, nobody's ever asking for this data. So that's also a call to investors to ask companies to show the data that they do collect and analyze themselves.
So half of companies don't have any purpose. When you go to work in the morning, Lene, do you feel purposeful or do you feel purposeless?
No, I certainly feel purposeful, I would say, in Maersk. And I think one of the reasons is, as you also explained. I think Maersk being the largest shipping company in the world, and increasingly also taking a role wanting to become an integrated logistics provider, so beyond shipping, taking an end-to-end approach in managing our customers' supply chains. All of this is a tremendously exciting transition to be part of. And one that clearly also has a huge potential societal as well as environmental impact. And it's both, as you say, for Maersk, especially on the shipping side, there is a big potential negative or actual negative impact in terms of emissions, absolutely. Well, one thing that has really galvanized the work that we do is we came out in the end of 2018, as you mentioned, with an ambition to be net zero by 2050 in our shipping operations, and by 2030 already to have the first carbon neutral vessel in commercial operations. So that's something that is really pushing a lot of action, as we were just discussing just a few minutes ago. I think you really see the power of setting targets here, right, and communicating a target, because we were doing a lot on reducing CO2 emissions before, but setting that bold ambition has just gotten things moving in a completely different level, not just externally, which was also the intention of going out with that target, but also internally. People really see, oh, this is something that, that we really mean, and that can help to, as you say, galvanize that purpose for people all over the company. So, but I think that's a good example, I think, of what target setting can do in a good sense, and I hope that that's also an experience that can go into the thoughts about the update of this regulation going forward.
Okay, and we may come back and discuss targeting in more detail later. But Sebastien, you represent the NGO, the wider stakeholder community here, and a lot of people within corporates say, well, they will always ask for more, they always want more, whatever we do. So I want to ask you, what surprised you in these results that perhaps that you might share with us that we wouldn't just expect an NGO to say?
The main surprise I had actually was I was feeling, oh my God, this is even worse than I expected. I found the result frankly appalling. We ran out of time. Everybody knows it. Everybody says it. Increasingly, cities, regions, governments, parliaments all over Europe and even beyond decide to set climate as an emergency. And now we see, in comparison, what companies are disclosing in terms of sustainability. And frankly, I find this disastrous. And it should be reminded, this is already mandatory in Europe. There are few places in the world where this is mandatory, but I'm forced to recognize that if we leave it like this, even if it's mandatory, it just doesn't work at all. So I'm feeling two things are needed for the next steps. The first one is to clarify, to streamline, to standardize this reporting so that it becomes meaningful very fast. But the second thing is actually going one step beyond, is to think that actually disclosure alone won't make the trick. We don't have time anymore for just disclosure. We need to move to corporate governance as a whole immediately, because we cannot afford anything else. If we want to avoid the climate disruption, the environmental disruption, the inequality disruption that might destroy our society and our planet, well, we just cannot wait for voluntary processes anymore. I mean, we have always voluntary leaders taking great practices. Maersk is an example. Triodos is an example. They are doing great work. But we are forced to recognize this is not enough to mainstream these approaches and make sure the entire economic sector and the entire financial sector are following this path from leaders. So in order to set up a level playing field, we come to the conclusion that the only way forward is regulation.
Okay, much to pick up on there. Let's just pick up on that, but we'll come back then to some of the detail in the reporting and in the potential regulation. But let's just pick up that challenge there about it shouldn't just be disclosure, it should be how you act upon it. Lene, you're a huge champion of saying that this is as important in the company for the management and to ensure that there is a link between your reporting and the strategy of the company, which we saw in so many companies at the moment. We don't see it in their business strategy. How have you managed to achieve that, and what lessons would you share with us about that?
Well, I think for Maersk it's been a long journey, right? We're by no means there yet. I think we have a great example in taking leadership on climate, which is critical also for our sector as well as for the planet, absolutely. I think it's an evolution that also happens along with, as issues become mature. What we've seen on climate just in the last couple of years, it's all across society that recognition has come that we are in a climate emergency. Everybody needs to do something, and we are in a position as the leader in the shipping industry to do that, right? Together with stakeholders, with our customers, etc. So that, I think that tipping point in the way that this is being discussed within society is what created the conditions for it to become part of our strategy, as we're talking about part of our business strategy, right? But I think when I talk about that, I think reporting and the way that we report on sustainability also needs to drive strategy internally. I think it's really important that we don't see sustainability reporting just as a reporting tool in itself, but that we need to focus on the material issues, report on those material issues that are relevant, and that we talk about how we manage them as well in terms inside the company. So I know we're going to be coming to, so maybe I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but I think materiality, right? And as has been mentioned also earlier today in the conversations, I think materiality is such a critical part of how to do reporting well. And one of the ways that it's possible to lift reporting in general, you call for regulation. Actually, it is part of regulation already, right? As you also say, but we're not seeing the kind of high quality reporting that we would like to on across companies. And I think one way is to provide better guidance to companies on how to actually do materiality in a good way.
Okay, I'm going to park that for a second. It's a really important point. Yeah. Let's just first, Rosl, give you a chance to answer or to reflect on Sebastien's challenge that this has to be about corporate governance. I know that's an area that obviously you look at as an investor.
Yes, that's one of the starting points when we look at companies. It's also related to the loop we were talking about earlier. So if companies have a clear purpose and then define how they're instrumentalizing the purpose and act upon it, and how does it relate back into targets and performance, I think that is very important. And I do agree that the way we are now moving is indeed far too slow. It is in regulation, but regulation is too ill-defined, I think. And what is definitely missing is a clear definition. So what is the measurement tool, so that we're all on the same page, and that the data that is out there, that it's comparable, because it's not at the moment. It's very difficult to compare the performance of one company to another company. So I'm not asking for more data. I don't want more data. I want relevant data, and I want comparable data. That's what we are looking for.
Okay, let's pick up Lene's challenge about materiality. We've heard it talked about a lot this afternoon. Yeah. Relevant is what you're looking for. Yeah. It's material. The argument that one sometimes hears is that financial materiality, all well and good, but it doesn't pick up many of the stakeholder interests and many of the externalities that are in fact the big challenges in our world. How do you marry together financial materiality with non-financial materiality?
Well, we do see some examples of companies that publish also social and environmental profit and loss accounts. I think that's a very good example of where companies marry the two aspects. What is certainly not helpful is that there are many different frameworks out there that partly overlap. That they, it's become a patchwork of data frameworks. And I wanted to say something and I forgot.
Come back in a minute, it's fine. Just Lene, before I come to Sebastien, some of the sustainability frameworks have quite a sort of mechanistic way of calculating sustainability. Others say you've just got to use your judgment. We've heard, I think, from what you said earlier and from others, that a bit more guidance in the directive is probably needed. What sort of extra level of detail could come on materiality that you think would genuinely help?
Well, I think partly some of the relevant guidance has already come through in the update from last year from the EU, or putting forth this concept of double materiality, right? So I think that helped actually to clarify what do we mean when we talk about risks, because that was actually not clear to in the legislation when it first came, because the word risk was used, but it was actually used to describe societal risks, right? So actually impacts rather than risk to the company. So I think to a large extent it was left to companies themselves to kind of figure out, well, we read this in the legislation, but you know, what do we think is a risk? How do we define it? And that, of course, has led to that great variance in what we see today. But I think that what will be helpful is to clarify to companies. I do think that it's important that there is both this focus on issues that are financially material, but particularly relevant to investors, of course, but also issues that are material which may not have a large financial impact, but which nevertheless are material from a sustainability perspective because they have a social or environmental impact. So one example I can give, the way that we work with materiality in Maersk, we've been working with a model since 2016, where we actually have a triple materiality approach. So we talk about how issues can be risks to the company, how they can be responsibilities, and in that word we actually mean issues where we can have a potential negative impact on society or the environment, and which we would therefore see as a responsibility on us, based on what stakeholders are expecting from us, or based on our own values as well. And finally, we talk about shared value. So those are the big strategic opportunities linked to our business model and linked to the great challenges in the world. So we use those three perspectives, and in the sustainability report, we outline kind of where the key issues that we see are material. Many of them, of course, have elements across. Some can be both responsibilities or risks and opportunities. But I think it's really important. And what was kind of a breakthrough for us when we started using this approach was that we were then able to describe more clearly how some of the sustainability issues that we work on really can have a financial impact, and that way elevate also internally the importance attached to actually working through these issues and setting targets and measuring outcomes and impacts. But on the other hand, also recognizing, okay, even though there's lots of sustainability issues that we work on, even though they're not financially material, we still need to actually manage those impacts, right? So I think that, yeah, that's how one example of how we have worked with it. There's other frameworks out there, and I would mention, I think there's one element that we feel that we have not yet incorporated well enough into how we work with it, that we want to improve on going forward, which is actually looking more at what you could call sort of absolute sustainability and more in a future fit context, right? So actually trying to set up some thresholds. Of course, on the climate side, we have already the Paris Agreement as one really relevant threshold to measure up against. But on a lot of the other issues that we talk about within the broad sustainability heading, we do not yet perhaps have very mainstream ideas about what constitutes the sort of the benchmark that we're measuring our targets and our impact up against.
Okay. Sebastien, I wanted to ask you about the same So no, and remember that the results of the survey are very marked in lack of materiality, so that those figures of 90% reporting on waste, but only less than 10% is it material, water over 50%, but only in 4%. I think it was describing the outcomes in water-stressed areas, human rights, 80% describe policies, but only 4% the actual outcomes in high-risk areas where human rights are most at threat. So a big difference there between, or a big failure, I suppose, on materiality in the current reporting, those figures. Do you like and stakeholders like the double materiality definition that the European Commission have now adopted? Do you feel that answers this question? And on Lena's point about thresholds, the argument about the sustainability context, that we're not really just rating individual companies, that's not the aim. The aim is whether we're tackling climate change or tackling other global challenges, and whether in aggregate we're actually doing enough together. Tell us, how do you respond to that?
Well, obviously, the NGOs like WWF and many more strongly support the double materiality approach. We think it's fundamental. However, the way it's done currently is not working well enough. So I think there are two elements of answers there. The first one is on reporting, and the second one is on target setting. As rightly mentioned by Lene, this is a critical issue, and so I'd like to come back on this afterwards. So the first one on reporting, as mentioned, as shown in the results, we believe it's now time to go to KPIs, and especially in our view, sector-specific KPIs, as few and as strategic, so you would say as material as possible, at sector or subsector level, to enable the comparison between comparable companies. So that means not trying to compare everybody, because different companies, it makes no sense to compare a bank and an extractive company, but trying to really compare the companies that can be compared in a meaningful way, so that this comparison is then easily done by different stakeholders, by the companies themselves first, of course, but also by different stakeholders like our NGOs, civil society organizations, trade unions, and also, of course, policymakers, investors, banks, etc. This is still extremely difficult to do, as mentioned by Triodos. The problem today we face is that there's an enormous amount of information, sustainability information, disclosed by data preparers that is largely useless for lots of data users, and there's lots of information expected by data users that is not published. So that doesn't work. So in our view, the idea of having KPIs, sector-specific KPIs, strategic ones, would try to fix this problem. And we think it's feasible. It's difficult to do. It's feasible with a multi-stakeholder process. The Commission actually rightly committed to start standardizing ESG reporting frameworks. I think this is a very important step forward. Then it depends how it's done. But this is very important to standardize this. And in order to maintain a good balance between comparability and flexibility and innovation, because it's sometimes difficult to agree on specific KPIs for specific sectors and specific issues. Sometimes it's difficult. I would use the recommendations of the technical expert group that issued a report on climate disclosure a few months ago, and they proposed to have a structure of reporting of KPIs in 3 levels. The first level would be the mandatory KPIs for all companies in a given sector, with no explain clause at all. The second level would be the recommended KPIs, and the third level would be the additional KPIs that the company might want to use or might even want to create themselves if they think some issues have not been reported properly with the former template. And with this template, I think it would greatly simplify and clarify sustainability reporting by companies and facilitate comparability.
Let's take that one head on then. I don't know which of you want to come in first responding to that, but the idea that we can, through a process, the Commission working with stakeholders, someone else at the European level, or potentially even at another level, can come up with a sufficiently small number of indicators which is good for comparability but which remains material. Is that possible, and should we be doing it? Rosl?
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. If, as I said, when we often have to contact companies when we do an analysis of a company, and then they say, "Oh, you want more data?" No, I don't want more data, but 80% of the data that's currently being collected is just not relevant. So it's the materiality. If I prefer a small number of relevant indicators with clear targets so we can follow up the progress and that we can compare within companies, that's of much more use than having, I don't know, 200 indicators being reported without any clear definition or target setting. That's just not helpful, not from an investor perspective, and also not from stakeholder perspective, and not even for companies, because you're actually wasting a lot of the time collecting that data.
Sorry. Lene, we often hear, not from your company, but from companies, that they don't want their hands tied too far. They want to be able to make judgments about these things. Where do you stand on all of that?
Well, I think it should be possible to, because I understand completely the need for comparability, and certainly I'm all for reducing also the number of indicators that needed to be reported on. But so I think it's possible to come up with a common set of more standardized metrics. I think there are many examples where we clearly are at a point where we can say, especially at sector level, obviously, which are some of the key metrics that must be included. But I would support that there is then a possibility to add on to that, right? I mean, for companies to be able to say, additionally, we believe that these issues are material for us to include, for example, because we know our stakeholders absolutely expect this, or because we feel, based on our values, or that this is something we want to report on. So if there is that combination, right, of both some flexibility for companies to explain, in addition to a common set of indicators across, I think that would be a good format.
Do you like that?
I think that's what would qualify under the may. That was the should and the would and the may. Yes, I do think there should be discretion for companies to report outside the sort of the standard or the sector-specific indicators. And it's actually the same as for financial reporting. There's also a discretion to develop your own financial instruments or indicators. So it's the same.
One of the choices I think that the European Union is going to have after the Commissioner Dombrovskis' speech is which of these indicators go in the directive and which of them go to the standard setter. Who would like to suggest to me where we would divide that particular cake? Anyone want to nod at me? Do the indicators, the standardised indicators that you've talked about, should they be in the revised directive, or should they be given to the standard setter in order to exist outside of the legal framework, but to be a standard that becomes the norm? Well, I'm going to look at anybody on that rather than any one person. Yeah, go for it. I can
make a suggestion, but actually the format is less important in my view than the policy direction and decision. I mean, it can be placed in different institutions. It could be the EFRAG doing this, or the EFRAG Corporate Reporting Lab, or another, or the EU platform on sustainable finance that is tasked. I mean, that will be set up soon to replace the TEG in a permanent way, and that will be tasked to develop the technical screening criteria for the taxonomy. And actually, the technical screening criteria for the taxonomy, to a large extent, are already very close to the sector-specific KPIs on environmental issues. If you look at power, steel, salmon, they already set up some key indicators on the climate side and soon on other environmental issues. So we are already working on these issues concretely to some extent. It's not everything, it's only environment, not social governance issues, but we're already getting there concretely. It could also be done not in the regulation itself, but in delegated acts of the regulation, with a review clause. I think this is really important to have a review clause every 3 years because things are moving forward fast. So it's important to keep it also relatively dynamic. But the key element is just to decide to go for it, and then to discuss how to set up the best possible process. And if I may, I'd like to go to the next step, which is the target setting issue that you mentioned, and broadening to the corporate governance elements. I think we relatively agree on the need to have this framework with the must, the should, and the may, so having both comparability for some KPIs and flexibility for others, to radically improve comparability and simplify reporting. But there's another step that is required, which is to have, to clarify this reporting must be forward-looking. There were two data in the report that horrified me. The first one is there's only 9% of the reporting of the companies on investment and R&D, which is CapEx. CapEx is the forward-looking information, is what you invest for the future of the company, while revenues is just the result of the previous CapEx. So it's just a backward-looking information. It's just a function of past investments of the company. And obviously, investors should all be focused more on CapEx because this is their own money that will be used by the company to shift its business model or not. And that's only on 9% of the companies doing it, while, as Philippe mentioned, companies, all large listed companies, by 2022 will be required to disclose their green CapEx, I mean, aligned with the taxonomy, and how much this is moving. So it will become a very available metric, and a metric very easy to compare for different companies, for different sectors, etc., for any investor. So I'm pretty sure that it will very quickly become a very useful metric for indicators to cherry-pick companies for their funds, and to exclude companies that have a significantly low CapEx, green CapEx, compared to other ones in the same sector. And I have a feeling companies still don't realize this. Things are moving faster than many people assume. Another element that was really...
I'm going to break that. I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Don't worry. But I am going to ask Rosl to respond to that. Particularly the challenge that you make about being forward-looking. Investors look forward. You're looking for returns in the future. You're assessing the information. And yet the survey showed how little forward-looking information was there. And for those of us who work on the TCFD, which is many in the room, only 7% using scenario analysis. And then on climate targets, 30%, so only a minority, but only 18% that align to the Paris goals. And the SDGs was one more that really astounded me. So the Nordic countries do well on that. Well done. But for all of the other countries, it's a minority of companies that even reference the SDGs. And these are all large companies. And given the amount of time and energy going into both SDGs and the TCFD, I must admit I was amazed by those results. Were you amazed as well? But also, how can we get companies to be more confident about looking forward?
I think one way is by not addressing sustainability as a risk, but as an opportunity. I think that also helps companies to have a more forward-looking view. I do see that more and more companies are actually reporting on the SDGs, but on a very high over level. So they just scratch the surface of relating their business to the SDGs without any evidence, without any materiality whatsoever. But still, it's a first attempt. Yes, target setting, of course, helps in the forward-looking arena, but also mostly from a risk perspective. So I would really encourage companies to look at sustainability as a opportunity, as a must going forward from a positive perspective, not from a negative perspective.
Lene, two things from that. One is, what's your own response on this being an opportunity and how we build that into the directive? But would you also comment about looking forward and how you've, as a company and in your work, have been able to be comfortable about looking forward in your reporting?
Yeah, so well, if I start with the forward-looking perspective first, I don't know if we're very good at that yet. I mean, certainly just setting a target to an ambition for 2050 and 2030, it does, of course, force us to then also look forward. And we are, pushing ourselves also to provide more information as well. We have our new sustainability report coming out on Thursday. If people want to have a look at that, please do. Now we put so much effort into it. But we will be putting more information, for example, into that report on, the roadmap that we see towards 2050 to actually achieving that ambition. But it's still very high level, right? We are not yet reporting on, I think, on specific indicators such as green capex. And we do also, I think we're in the same boat around the SDGs, where we report on our thinking around it. But I think still also yet have to make that link, as I was saying before, to the SDGs and to other sort of, if you look at that order, as I mentioned, the future fit perspective, of really putting it in that external context of what we actually need to drive impact. So we have more work to do there, absolutely. But if you think more on that opportunity perspective, I think that's hugely important for companies to really get them engaged on the sustainability agenda. I mean, that's really, looking at sustainability as an opportunity for creating new business, as an opportunity for business to come in and use their capacity to solve problems, right, around global challenges. I think that's really energizing for a lot of business people, and I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen also the SDGs be a successful framework. And we saw recently at the World Economic Forum, right, in Davos, where that's another example of a very sort of mainstream business forum that's really taking on the climate, crisis as an opportunity, and really linking in business perspectives on what can be done here. So I completely agree. I think it's really critical to see it as an opportunity. But I would just also then caution again to continue to have that focus on the impact side and the responsibility side, because I do think that's where there can be perhaps a potential risk for business to get very excited about the opportunities and maybe overlook also the responsibilities.
The KPIs can be, of course, yes, on opportunities, yeah, and the risks, yeah, in that sense.
There's been a lot of discussion in this panel about the climate emergency, understandably and quite rightly, less about business and human rights. Yeah. And that figure that 90% of companies are reporting on impacts on their employees, they're comfortable with that, but less than 10% on local communities, farmers. Only 5 companies out of 1,000 reporting on how they're working with human rights organisations and defenders. How do we make sure that doesn't get left behind? Does anyone want to come back on that? Rosl? You were nodding, so I'm hoping that was a nod at me.
Yeah, that is quite complex, but because some things it's very difficult to grasp in numbers, right? And that's also something that we, as an organisation, we also report on the positive impact that we have on society, including the social elements. And what we do there is that we focus on transparency. I think that's very important, so that our clients know what we are financing, what are the choices that we are making. We tell the stories of the companies, of the investments that we're doing, and then we support that with as much data as we can. But we flip it around. We don't start with the data and then have some examples. We start with the approach. How do we do it? Then we discuss the stories, and then we support that with data. But it is challenging, and it also, as a financial organization sort of it cascades down, right? If companies do not report on the data, do not collect the data, then for us it's even more difficult to collect all the data, to aggregate all the data. So the better companies start reporting, the more it's helpful also for us to do our reporting.
Thank you. Lene, did you want to respond to that?
Yes. So human rights, I think, is a little bit more difficult, right? In a sense, to because it's many things at once. It's an umbrella term for many sort of single issues, right? Issues like safety and labor rights, for example, which we also then report on separately. But then when we report on human rights, we tend to have very much of a process focus. You know, what are the policies we have in place? What's our governance? For example, right? And that doesn't lend itself very easily to then report on outcomes or impacts. Certainly not in any numerical sense, I would say. So I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why we get these results in the survey, is that when companies work on human rights, they tend to work on it in this sort of process-oriented way. You know, we have to have a policy in place, and we report on that. Again, I think that is one area where it really will help to have a little bit more specific standards on what is the expectation, I just think that as long as in the process of defining these sort of common indicators, that there is let's say a multi-stakeholder process involved in helping to set these indicators, so companies are also heard, then I think there's a good chance of landing in with a set also on human rights that can meet the needs of stakeholders and investors, and at the same time not overload companies. One point...
I'm going to have to break in there because we'll run out of time, but can I come back to you shortly and ask Sebastien, who was trying to get in?
On human rights, there's usually agreement that it's more difficult to report and have measurable KPIs on human rights, and actually my human rights colleagues in other NGOs and groups are usually more focused on the due diligence side. And when I see in the study that only 22% of companies describe the due diligence process, I think this is where we need to move the next step beyond disclosure, and where we need to have the EU set up a mandatory due diligence process for all large companies. Not only mandatory disclosure of the due diligence process, mandatory establishment of a due diligence process within every large company, listed or not, by the way, and on environmental and human rights issues, because otherwise we're not going to get there. I mean, we will need decades to achieve a relevant level of do no harm. And there's a huge opportunity for this right now, which is the European Green Deal launched by the Commission, which includes an oath, a do no harm oath. That's the key opportunity to go to this mandatory due diligence processes and approaches. Otherwise, we are still dealing with very suboptimal voluntary approaches which don't make the trick.
And of course, if Charlotte Gard were here, she'd be very much agreeing with that. And in France in 2017, the Devoir de Vigilance law was passed, and part of their National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights is to bring that to the European level. So I think that will be part of the discussions coming forward. But I'm also acutely aware there are people in the audience like Phil Bloomer, who's coming up shortly, who's a director of the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. And we've also got the SHIFT project that's doing work on valuing respect, where there's quite a lot of work in the human rights community about indices. So it is there, and perhaps Phil will be talking about that in the panel that will follow us. The last substantive question I want to go down the panel and ask is, what next? We know, and we'll be hearing from Alan Decker from the European Commission to close the afternoon, but we know that they are committed, and the commissioners are committed to revise this directive. We know that there is a massive interest around this. Look at this. This room could have been filled double times over, and we sold out the tickets within days. People are very, very interested in all of this. You know, as someone who was there 10 and more years ago trying to get the first directive passed, to me it feels different in terms of the possibilities and policy environment in terms of what we can get. Am I over-optimistic? What do you think, Sebastien, about that?
The market is moving forward. Policymakers are moving forward. It's still too slow. So with the revision, actually, of the European Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, with the revision of the Non-Reporting Financial Directive, with the European Green Deal, I think we have a unique opportunity to really set the bar much, much higher and accelerate the steps forward. What we think is needed is a review, as already committed by the Commission very rightly, a review of the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which actually should change name as well and format. We think it should be a sustainability regulation, because non-financial is a very unhelpful wording for something that the TCFD and everybody says it's at least partly financial. So let's clarify, this is sustainability reporting. It's not non-financial, because in some cases it is. So we need a regulation there. We need a regulation on directors' duties, including, in our view, elements on mandatory sustainability strategies and measurable targets, science-based where feasible, for large corporates. And we need a third regulation on due diligence, human rights and environmental due diligence. I think it's better to separate, because mixing up too many things will be complex. But we think we have the opportunity to make this work right now, and we should move forward very quickly.
Thank you. Lene?
So I agree, this is really, in my opinion, a timely update that the Commission has started on. And I actually like the idea of calling it a sustainability reporting instead of non-financial reporting, because I completely agree that does tend to create some confusion. So I'm really looking forward to what comes out of the work.
Okay. Rosl?
Well, I think we can also learn a great deal from how financial reporting is currently structured. For that, there is a real architecture in place. There are reporting standards setter, there's assurance standards, and I think we need the same sort of architecture also for this sustainability or extra financial information, or however we call it.
Should it be assured?
It should be assured.
That was the shortest answer to one of the biggest questions. Ladies and gentlemen, in the run-up to 2014, in every meeting like this, actually you would have company associations on one side saying we can do all this voluntarily and we don't need regulation at all. And then you'd have other stakeholders saying it can only be done by regulation. And to try and manoeuvre one's way through that was hard, but we did it. One of the great things that makes me optimistic off the back of the survey is that that question hasn't even been put once in this discussion here today between companies and stakeholders. And for me, that is a sign that this has really moved on. I cannot congratulate the Alliance enough for the quality of the survey. I think it's fantastic and gives us an evidence base by which we can continue to build the consensus to get a very strong and progressive reform of the directive. Can I ask you to join me in thanking our fellow speakers?